Right. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, as previous Labor speakers have indicated, we will be supporting this piece of legislation. It's a small technical bill. It's not controversial. It's not contentious. It does remedy technical deficiencies in the Criminal Procedures Reform and Modernisation Act that went through just last year. And I tend to agree with the Minister that introduced it, Chester Borrows, that we're not going to make a big deal about those deficiencies. It was a substantial act. It was 520 pages. Sometimes governments get those things wrong, or draftspeople get those things wrong. But what I want to say is that this is also a bill that doesn't address some of the huge problems that we're seeing in criminal justice procedures at the present time. This bill, for example, does nothing to remedy the disastrous situation in Auckland with the new system of processing family court cases. That system, Mr Speaker, is a system that lawyers and judges alike have said is an absolute shambles. The quote in the media was that affidavits were going missing, judges were not being given complete files, there were delays of several months in hearing dates, sealed orders weren't being sent, emails and voice messages were going unanswered. That, as Mr Borrows knows well because he was the Minister in charge of that failed experiment, has proven to be an absolute disaster, and there is nothing in this bill that remedies a mess which is a mess of the Minister and the Government's own making. Sadly, there is nothing in this bill that remedies another serious problem that the Minister alluded to before about justice delayed being justice denied. The Minister will know that there's a backlog of 900 jury court cases in Auckland. 900. I want to know from the Minister when he's going to bring in a piece of substantive legislation or put the resources in or make the changes necessary to address that other disaster in Auckland. So we've got a disaster in the family court system where procedures simply aren't working because the government has botched it. We've got a disaster in a growing backlog of jury cases in Auckland where we are denying justice. We had a near disaster caused by the government introducing legal aid legislation that would have stripped the system completely of equity, because the other way of denying justice is not simply delaying it, Minister, it's by making justice inaccessible to people because of a user-pays system. You know, the Minister knows that the threshold level for income that the government was intending to introduce would have stripped access to justice from a whole cross-section of New Zealanders. New Zealanders, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, are entitled to have access to the justice system. What sort of justice system is it that is based on ability to pay? And sadly, Mr Speaker, in an earlier bill today, we saw more of that coming in with a proposed $1,000 fee for people to have access to family dispute resolution processes. That access used to be free. It's not free now. So we have this little piece of legislation. It does make technical amendments, but it leaves untouched the disaster that is happening across our justice system in each of the four areas that I've just talked about. Now, Mr Speaker, I want to pick up some of the points that Leanne Dalzell made because I thought they were well made, and that is that, you know, in a proper parliament, justice issues should be handled wherever possible in a bipartisan way. They should be evidence-driven. They should be well-researched. Changes being made should be properly trialled. But sadly, once again, earlier this afternoon, we saw a piece of legislation that did none of those things. And, you know, I think the Law Society and the President of the Law Society, Jonathan Temm, was right in saying it's incumbent upon Parliament to pick up these issues and work to try to find a resolution to problems that are afflicting our justice system, rather than being dog whistle, as too much of the legislation in this Parliament has been. It's not been actually about improving the justice system. It's been about trying to scratch an electoral itch, appealing to a concern in the community, which is inherently dishonest, because what the government is doing is pretending to implement a solution that, quite cynically, they know will not be a solution to the problem at all, and that leaves the safety and the well-being of New Zealanders at risk. And the other part of what the government has done wrong is too often it's rushed stuff through. I can't say that about the original the criminal procedures legislation. That actually had its origins under Labor in 2007 in the Simplification Project. And it was a good concept. We needed to make it more efficient. We needed to make it more effective. We worked on that. The legislation was ultimately carried through by the National Party, but even then, they brought in things that were inherently controversial and unacceptable. We all wanted a more efficient system, but too much in terms of long-standing human rights were under threat in the original criminal procedures legislation. And I've got to pay tribute to Charles Chauvel and what the Labor opposition did in bringing in a minority report that was persuasive to other members of the opposition, but also persuasive to the government support parties, the Maori Party and the ACT Party. And the government had to reverse some of the controversial measures that they were putting up there. They had to bring back the threshold for a jury trial, for example, from the 3 years they were proposing to 2 years. They had to reverse their proposals where they could try a person in their absence. God, since the Magna Carta, that hasn't been allowed anywhere else in the world, and this government was trying to do it. So a lot of mistakes have been made by the National Party, yet the Labor Party stands ready as a constructive party of opposition, not only to exercise proper scrutiny over what the government is doing, but also prepared to assist and to help to improve the legislation, as we did with that Criminal Procedures Act. Without the Labor Party and the stand that Labor took, that would not have been improved in the way that it was. So we certainly lifted the government's game in that respect. The amendments that we're looking at in this bill, Mr Speaker, are essentially technical. It provides cross-referencing and other minor technical fixes. It ensures that processes and procedures that are necessary to implement the 2011 Act are actually in place. It deals with the repeal of the definition of crime in the Crimes Act and makes consequential amendments there. It gives effect to changes in the jurisdiction of community magistrates. So there is nothing in this bill that we are opposed to inherently, but I just want to use this bill as an example that where a government brings in a piece of legislation that does the right thing, we're not going to oppose for the sake of opposing. But the government itself needs to show the same sort of flexibility. And it's sad, Mr Speaker, it's sad that we're going to be looking at an alcohol bill in 2 days' time where national members of parliament will be forced to vote against their own preference and their own best instincts because they're being forced to toe the party line. And little things like, having proper regulation for RTDs, that's something that's cross-partisan. I've talked to my colleagues across the other side of the House. They think it's necessary, but they're being prevented from doing so, and that's wrong. And I mention that, Mr Speaker, because it's an example of a government that is ideologically driven by the power of vested interest groups, and doesn't take a sufficiently bipartisan approach to get the best out of this House, to get the best legislation for New Zealand. Labor will be supporting this piece of legislation because it does the right thing. It opposed the legislation earlier today because it was ill thought out, half-baked, bound to be a disaster in terms of its implementation, and we have a requirement on us to expose the deficiencies of the government in that regard. This bill will pass. It will pass with our cooperation, but the lesson that the national government should learn is to make sure its legislation is evidence-driven, make sure it's not driven by the power of vested interests, make sure it's not simply ideological, and make sure, most of all, that it's not dog whistle. Because far too much of the legislation in the justice area before the Parliament has been all of those things, and that will be the legacy of this government when it goes in a couple of years' time. It will be a large percentage of justice legislation that changes nothing, does nothing. This bill, however, is technical, it's non-controversial. We'll be supporting it.
Call Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call on the Criminal Procedures Legislation Bill. The last speaker